Okay, please have a seat. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to ask the court deputy to hand each of you a copy. These are the jury instructions I'm about to read on the record to you. You'll have a copy to follow along. At the end, I'm going to go over the verdict form with you. That is not attached here because we only send one back with you. But we'll put it up there and you can follow along as I go through the verdict form. So please hand one out to each of the jurors.
Judge, one of the jurors needs to run back and get her glasses.
Absolutely.
Anybody else? Everybody has glasses? Okay.
Give me a second till he gets done with the phone call so that we can. Okay, he lowered his voice a little bit, so let's start now. Members of the jury, I want to thank you for your attention during this trial. Please pay attention to the instructions I'm about to give you, and again, please follow along with your copy. Armando Baptista, the defendant in this case, has been accused of the crime of manslaughter with a weapon. In this case, he is accused of manslaughter with a weapon, a killing that is excusable. Let me read this back again. In this case, Armando Baptista is accused of manslaughter with a weapon. A killing that is excusable or was committed by the use of justifiable deadly force is lawful. If you find Fakhreddin Knight was killed by Armando Baptista, you will then consider the circumstances surrounding the killing in deciding if the killing was manslaughter or whether the killing was excusable or resulted from justifiable use of deadly force. Justifiable homicide. The killing of a human being is justifiable homicide and lawful if necessarily done while resisting an attempt to murder or commit a felony upon the defendant, or to commit a felony in any occupied vehicle in which the defendant was at the time of the killing. Excusable homicide. The killing of a human being is excusable and therefore lawful under any one of the following three circumstances. 1. When the killing is committed by accident and misfortune in doing any lawful act by lawful means with usual ordinary caution and without any unlawful intent. Or 2, when the killing occurs by accident and misfortune in the heat of passion upon any sudden and sufficient provocation. Or 3, when the killing is committed by accident and misfortune resulting from a sudden combat, if a dangerous weapon is not used and the killing is not done in a cruel or unusual manner. Dangerous weapon is any weapon that, taking into account the manner in which it is used, is likely to produce death or great bodily harm. I now instruct you on the circumstances that must be proved before Armando Baptista may be found guilty of manslaughter or any lesser included crime. To prove the crime of manslaughter, the state must prove the following two elements beyond a reasonable doubt. 1. Fakhreddin Knight is dead. 2. Armando Baptista intentionally committed an act or acts that caused the death of Fakhreddin Knight or the death of Fakhreddin Knight was caused by the culpable negligence of Armando Baptista. Every person has a duty to act reasonably toward others. If there is a violation of that duty without any conscious intention to harm, that violation is negligence. The defendant cannot be guilty of manslaughter by committing a merely negligent act, or if the killing was either justifiable or excusable homicide, as I have previously instructed you. In order to convict of manslaughter by act, it is not necessary for the state to prove that the defendant had an intent to cause death, only an intent to commit an act that was not merely negligent, justified, or excusable, and which caused death. I will now define culpable negligence for you. As I have said, every person has a duty to act reasonably toward others. If there is a violation of that duty without any conscious intention to harm, that violation is negligence. But culpable negligence is more than a failure to use ordinary care toward others. In order for negligence to be culpable, it must be gross and flagrant. Culpable negligence is a course of conduct showing reckless disregard of human life or of the safety of persons exposed to its dangerous effects, or such an entire want of care as to raise a presumption of conscious indifference to consequences, or which shows wantonness or recklessness, or a grossly careless disregard for the safety and welfare of the public, or such an indifference to the rights of others as is equivalent to an intentional violation of such rights. The negligent act or omission must have been committed with an utter disregard for the safety of others. Culpable negligence is consciously doing an act or following a course of conduct that the defendant must have known or reasonably should have known was likely to cause death or great bodily injury. In considering the evidence, you should consider the possibility that although the evidence may not convince you that the defendant committed the main crime of which he is accused, there may be evidence that he committed other acts that would constitute a lesser included crime. Therefore, if you decide that the main accusation has not been proved beyond a reasonable doubt, you will next need to decide if the defendant is guilty of any lesser included crime. The lesser crimes indicated in the definition of manslaughter with a weapon are battery and culpable negligence. To prove the crime of battery, the state must prove the following elements beyond a reasonable doubt. Armando Baptista intentionally caused bodily harm to Fakhreddin Knight. Culpable negligence. To prove the crime of culpable negligence, the state must prove the following two elements beyond a reasonable doubt. 1. Armando Baptista inflicted actual personal injury on Fakhreddin Knight, and 2. He did so through culpable negligence. I will now define culpable negligence for you. Each of us has a duty to act reasonably toward others. If there is a violation of that duty without any conscious intention to harm, that violation is negligence. But culpable negligence is more than a failure to use ordinary care for others. In order for negligence to be culpable, it must be gross and flagrant. Culpable negligence is a course of conduct showing reckless disregard for human life or for the safety of persons exposed to its dangerous effects, or such an entire want of care as to raise a presumption of a conscious indifference to consequences, or which shows wantonness or recklessness, or a grossly careless disregard for the safety and welfare of the public, or shows such an indifference to the rights of others as is equivalent to an intentional violation of such rights. Excuse me. Justifiable use of deadly force. An issue in this case is whether the defendant acted in self-defense. It is a defense to the offense with which Armando Baptista is charged if the death of Fakhreddin Knight resulted from the justifiable use of deadly force. Deadly force means force likely to cause death or great bodily harm. The use of deadly force is justifiable only if the defendant reasonably believes that the force is necessary to prevent imminent death or great bodily harm to himself while resisting 1, another's attempt to murder him, or 2, any attempt to commit aggravated battery, aggravated assault, or burglary upon him, or 3, any attempt to commit aggravated battery, aggravated assault, or burglary upon or in any vehicle occupied by him. The following 2 elements define aggravated battery. 1, Fakhreddin Knight intentionally touched or struck Armando Baptista against his will. 2, Fakhreddin Knight, in committing the battery, used a deadly weapon. A weapon is a deadly weapon if it is used or threatened to be used in a way likely to produce death or great bodily harm. The following 4 elements define aggravated assault. Fakhreddin Knight intentionally and unlawfully threatened, either by word or act, to do violence to Armando Baptista. 2, at the time Fakhreddin Knight appeared to have the ability to carry out the threat. 3, the act of Fakhreddin Knight created in the mind of Armando Baptista a well-founded fear that the violence was about to take place. 4, the assault was made with a deadly weapon. A weapon is a deadly weapon if it is used or threatened to be used in a way likely to produce death or great bodily harm. The following 2 elements define burglary. 1, Fakhreddin Knight entered a conveyance owned by or in the possession of Demetrius Elder and or Armando Baptista. 2, at the time of entering the conveyance, Fakhreddin had the... Can we go sidebar for a second? Let me go back to the following 2 elements that define burglary. 1, Fakhreddin Knight entered a conveyance owned by or in the possession of Demetrius Elder and or Armando Baptista. 2, at the time of entering the conveyance, Fakhreddin Knight had the intent to commit a battery or assault in that conveyance. The entry necessary need not be the whole body of Fakhreddin Knight. It is sufficient if Fakhreddin Knight, with the intent to commit a crime, extends any part of his body into the conveyance. The intent with which an act is done is an operation of the mind, and therefore is not always capable of direct and positive proof. It may be established by circumstantial evidence, like any other fact in a case. Conveyance means any motor vehicle, ship, vessel, railroad car, trailer, aircraft, or sleeping car, and to enter a conveyance includes taking apart any portion of the conveyance. A person is justified in using deadly force if he reasonably believes that such force is necessary to prevent 1, imminent death or great bodily harm to himself, or 2, the imminent commission of aggravated battery, aggravated assault, or burglary against himself. However, the use of deadly force is not justified if you find 1, Armando Baptista initially provoked the use of force against himself, unless A, the force asserted toward the defendant was so great that he reasonably believed that he was in imminent danger of death or great bodily harm and had exhausted every reasonable means to escape the danger other than using deadly force on Fakhreddin Knight. B, in good faith, the defendant withdrew from physical contact with Fakhreddin Knight and clearly indicated to Fakhreddin Knight that he wanted to withdraw and stop the use of deadly force, but Fakhruddin Knight continued or resumed the use of force. In deciding whether the defendant was justified in the use of deadly force, you must judge him by the circumstances by which he was surrounded at the time the force was used. The danger facing the defendant need not have been actual. However, to justify the use of deadly force, the appearance of danger must have been so real that a reasonably cautious and prudent person under the same circumstances would have believed that the danger could be avoided only through the use of that force. Based upon appearances, the defendant must have actually believed that the danger was real. If the defendant was attacked in any place where he had a right to be, he had no duty to retreat and had the right to stand his ground and meet force with force, including deadly force, if he reasonably believed that it was necessary to do so to prevent death or great bodily harm to himself or another, or to prevent the commission of a forcible felony, to wit, aggravated battery, aggravated assault, or burglary. If Armando Baptista was in an occupied vehicle where he had a right to be, he is presumed to have had a reasonable fear of imminent death or great bodily harm to himself or another if Fakhruddin Knight had unlawfully and forcibly entered that occupied vehicle and the defendant had reason to believe that had occurred. The defendant had no duty to retreat under such circumstances. A person who unlawfully and by force enters or attempts to enter another's occupied vehicle is presumed to be doing so with the intent to commit an unlawful act involving force or violence. Vehicle means a conveyance of any kind, whether or not motorized, which is designed to transport people or property. In considering the issue of self-defense, you may take into account the relative physical abilities and capacities of the defendant and Fakhruddin Knight. If in your consideration of the issue of self-defense, you have a reasonable doubt on the question of whether the defendant was justified in the use of deadly force, you should find the defendant not guilty. However, if from the evidence you are convinced that the defendant was not justified in the use of deadly force, you should find him guilty if all the elements of the charge have been proven. Justifiable use of non-deadly force. An issue in this case is whether the defendant acted in self-defense. It is a defense to the offense with which Armando Baptista is charged if the death of Fakhruddin Knight resulted from the justifiable use of non-deadly force. Non-deadly force means force not likely to cause death or great bodily harm. Armando Baptista would be justified in using non-deadly force against Fakhruddin Knight if the following two facts are proved. One, Armando Baptista must have reasonably believed that such conduct was necessary to defend himself or another against Fakhruddin Knight's imminent use of unlawful force against the defendant or another person. Two, the use of unlawful force by Fakhruddin Knight must have appeared to Armando Baptista to be ready to take place. If the defendant is in an occupied vehicle, he is presumed to have a reasonable fear of imminent peril of death or bodily injury to himself or another if Fakhruddin Knight has unlawfully and forcibly entered that occupied vehicle and the defendant had reason to believe that had occurred. The defendant had no duty to retreat under such circumstances. A person who unlawfully and by force enters or attempts to enter another's occupied vehicle is presumed to be doing so with the intent to commit an unlawful act involving force or violence. If the defendant was attacked in any place where he had a right to be, he had no duty to retreat and had the right to stand his ground and meet force with force, including deadly force, if he reasonably believed that it was necessary to do so to prevent death or great bodily harm to himself or another, or to prevent the commission of a forcible felony, to wit, aggravated battery, aggravated assault, and burglary. The definition of these offenses are the same as has been previously read to you in instruction 3.6F above. As used with regard to self-defense, vehicle means a conveyance of any kind, whether or not motorized, which is designed to transport people or property. A person does not have a duty to retreat if the person is in a place where he has a right to be. The use of non-deadly force is not justified if you find, 1, Armando Baptista initially provoked the use of force against himself, unless A, the force asserted against the defendant was so great that he reasonably believed that he was in imminent danger of death or great bodily harm and had exhausted every reasonable means to escape the danger other than using non-deadly force on Fakhruddin Knight. B, in good faith, the defendant withdrew from physical contact with Fakhruddin Knight and indicated clearly to Fakhruddin Knight that he wanted to withdraw and stop the use of non-deadly force, but Fakhruddin Knight continued or resumed the use of force. In deciding whether the defendant was justified in the use of non-deadly force, you must judge him by the circumstances by which he was surrounded at the time the force was used. The danger facing the defendant need not have been actual. However, to justify the use of non-deadly force, the appearance of danger must have been so reasonable that had been so real. Let me read that again, please. In deciding whether the defendant was justified in the use of non-deadly force, you must judge him by the circumstances by which he was surrounded at the time the force was used. The danger facing the defendant need not have been actual, however. To justify the use of non-deadly force, the appearance of danger must have been so real that a reasonably cautious and prudent person, under the same circumstances, would have believed that the danger could be avoided only through the use of that force. Based upon appearances, the defendant must have actually believed the danger was real. In considering the issue of self-defense, you may take into account the relative physical abilities and capacities of the defendant and Fakhruddin Knight. If, in your consideration of the issue of self-defense, you have a reasonable doubt on the question of whether the defendant was justified in the use of non-deadly force, you should find the defendant not guilty. However, if from the evidence you are convinced that the defendant was not justified in the use of non-deadly force, then you should find him guilty if all the elements of the charge have been proved. The defendant has entered a plea of not guilty. This means you must presume or believe the defendant is innocent. The presumption stays with the defendant as to each material allegation in the information through each stage of the trial unless it has been overcome by the evidence to the exclusion of and beyond a reasonable doubt. To overcome the defendant's presumption of innocence, the state has the burden of proving the crime with which the defendant is charged was committed, and the defendant is the person who committed the crime. The defendant is not required to present evidence or prove anything. Whenever the words reasonable doubt are used, you must consider the following. A reasonable doubt is not a mere possible doubt, a speculative, imaginary, or forced doubt. Such a doubt must not influence you to return the verdict of not guilty if you have an abiding conviction of guilt. On the other hand, if after carefully considering, comparing, and weighing all the evidence, there is not an abiding conviction of guilt, or if having a conviction, it is one which is not stable, but one which wavers and vacillates, then the charge is not proved beyond every reasonable doubt, and you must find the defendant not guilty because the doubt is reasonable. It is to the evidence introduced in this trial and to it alone that you are to look for that proof. A reasonable doubt as to the guilt of the defendant may arise from the evidence, conflict in the evidence, or lack of evidence. If you have a reasonable doubt, you should find the defendant not guilty. If you have no reasonable doubt, you should find the defendant guilty. It is up to you to decide what evidence is reliable. You should use your common sense in deciding which is the best evidence, and which evidence should not be relied upon in considering your verdict. You may find some of the evidence not reliable or less reliable than other evidence. You should consider how the witnesses acted as well as what they said. Some things you should consider are: 1. Did the witness seem to have an opportunity to see and know the things about which the witness testified? 2. Did the witness seem to have an accurate memory? 3. Was the witness honest and straightforward in answering the attorney's questions? 4. Did the witness have some interest in how the case should be decided? 5. Does the witness's testimony agree with the other testimony and other evidence in the case? 6. Did the witness at some other time make a statement that is inconsistent with the testimony he or she gave in court? 7. Has the witness been convicted of a felony? Whether the state has met its burden of proof does not depend upon the number of witnesses it has called or upon the number of exhibits it has offered, but instead upon the nature and quality of the evidence presented. The fact that a witness is employed in law enforcement does not mean that his or her testimony deserves more or less consideration than that of any other witness. Expert witnesses are like other witnesses, with one exception. The law permits an expert witness to give his or her opinion. However, an expert's opinion is reliable only when given on a subject about which you believe him or her to be an expert. Like other witnesses, you may believe or disbelieve all or any part of the expert's testimony. It is entirely proper for a lawyer to talk to a witness about what testimony the witness would give if called to the courtroom. The witness should not be discredited by talking to a lawyer about his or her testimony. You may rely upon your own conclusion about the credibility of any witness. A juror may believe or disbelieve all or any part of the evidence or the testimony of any evidence. The Constitution requires the state to prove its accusations against the defendant. It is not necessary for the defendant to disprove anything. Nor is the defendant required to prove his innocence. It is up to the state to prove the defendant's guilt by evidence. The defendant exercised the fundamental right by choosing not to be a witness in this case. You must not view this as an admission of guilt or be influenced in any way by his decision. No juror should ever be concerned that the defendant did or did not take the witness stand to give testimony in this case. These are some general rules that apply to your discussion. You must follow these rules in order to return a lawful verdict. 1. You must follow the laws as set out in these instructions. If you fail to follow the law, your verdict will be a miscarriage of justice. There's no reason for failing to follow the law in this case. All of us are depending upon you to make a wise and legal decision in this matter. This case must be decided only upon the evidence that you have heard from the testimony of the witnesses and have seen in the form of the exhibits and evidence and these instructions. The case must not be decided for or against anyone because you feel sorry for anyone or are angry at anyone. Remember, the lawyers are not on trial. Your feelings about them should not influence your decision in this case. Your duty is to determine if the defendant has been proven guilty or not in accord with the law. It is the judge's job to determine a proper sentence if the defendant is found guilty. Whatever verdict you render must be unanimous. That is, each juror must agree to the same verdict. Your verdict should not be influenced by feelings of prejudice, bias, or sympathy. Your verdict must be based on the evidence and the law contained in these instructions. Deciding a verdict is exclusively your job. I cannot participate in that decision in any way. Please disregard anything I may have said or done that made you think I preferred one verdict over another. Elaine, can you get ready to do this in a moment? You may find the defendant guilty as charged in the indictment or guilty of such lesser included crime as the evidence may justify or not guilty. If you return a verdict of guilty, it should be for the highest offense which has been proven beyond a reasonable doubt. If you find that no offense has been proven beyond a reasonable doubt, then of course your verdict must be not guilty. The verdict must be unanimous. That is, all of you must agree to the same verdict. Only one verdict may be returned as to the crime charged. The verdict must be in writing, and for your convenience, the necessary form has been prepared for you. Elaine?
Yes, Judge.
It is as follows, and please look at the screen. In the Circuit Court of the 17th Judicial Circuit, in for Broward County, Florida, case number 146991, CF 10A, State of Florida versus Armando Baptista, verdict. We, the jury, find as follows as to the defendant in this case. And then it's going to instruct you to check only one. A, the defendant is guilty of manslaughter as charged in the information. B, the defendant is guilty of battery, a lesser included offense. C, the defendant is guilty of culpable negligence, a lesser included offense. D, the defendant is not guilty. If you find the defendant guilty of the crime of manslaughter listed above, you must answer the following question. During the course of the crime committed, did the defendant, Armando Baptista, use a deadly weapon? And then it's going to ask you, you're going to have to check one, either yes or check no. You would only get to that question with respect to A above. And then it says, so say we all this blank day of November 2018 at Fort Lauderdale, Broward County, Florida. And then there's a signature line for the foreperson, and we do ask the foreperson to print his or her name below the signature. And after the closing arguments, I'll give you more instructions on the foreperson's job. So, State, are you ready to proceed?
Yes, sir.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, both the state and the defendant have now rested. The attorneys will now present their final arguments. Please remember that what the attorneys say is not evidence or your instruction on the law. However, do listen closely to their arguments. They are intended to aid you in understanding the case. Each side will have equal time, but the state is entitled to divide this time between an opening argument and a rebuttal argument after the defense has given its closing argument. Now, State, let me ask you, are you ready to proceed?
Yes, Your Honor.
Okay, you may proceed.
Thank you.